Hi, my name is Abby Smith, and my case report is on the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis, happening during the Kennedy administration, was a direct and dangerous confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States, which was the closest two world superpowers came to a nuclear war. There were many reasons to why the Cuban Missile Crisis happened. Tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union were already high, but the United States ordering an invasion into Cuba pushed the Soviet Union to retaliate. Authorized by President Kennedy, on April 17, 1961, 1,400 Cuban exiles were CIA trained and launched a poorly executed attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro's communist government. This mission ultimately failed and was a major embarrassment for the United States, which then resulted in a strengthened alliance between Cuba and the Soviet Union. This is a situation where I believe both parties needed to take responsibility for the rising tensions. If you look at it from an outside perspective, you can see both sides. Kennedy viewed Castro's communist regime as a threat to Latin America, and Castro and the Soviet Union saw the United States' attack as a threat that they needed to be ready for the next time. Over a year later, after the Bay of Pigs invasion, in July 1962, there was a secret meeting between Fidel Castro and Khrushchev to place nuclear missiles in Cuba to deter any future U.S. aggression. This agreement led to the building of missile sites later that same summer. But why was this a problem? Why does a new strengthened alliance have any threat to the United States? The secret meeting and alliance to store missiles in Cuba gave them the upper hand. The alliance wasn't the only problem. It's the secret building of ballistic missiles. Kennedy and his administration had good but incomplete knowledge of the Soviet Union's nuclear capabilities. But all that intelligence goes out the window when there are missiles being built in a completely different area for another enemy country. It's an even bigger problem when those missiles being built have the capability to reach U.S. soil within minutes of launch. In September 1962, Kennedy warned Khrushchev of building missiles in Cuba and vowed that the United States will do whatever must be done to protect its own security and that of its allies. Khrushchev believed that President Kennedy was weak and would not react to the Soviet move and built the missiles anyway. Immediate action was taken. A day later, October 16, 1962, the 13-day conflict began. President Kennedy, principal foreign policy officials, and national defense officials were briefed on the U-2 plane's findings. Due to the growing crisis that this was, on day 7 of the conflict, President Kennedy formally established the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, and he instructed them to meet every day during this period. This temporary advisory committee was made up of permanent national security members and other officials whose input Kennedy wanted during this crisis. Some of these titles included Secretary of State, Defense, and the Attorney General. President Kennedy had one main focus during this crisis. How do we keep the American people out of harm's way? Kennedy knew one wrong move could send them into a nuclear war, killing millions of American citizens and people around the world. Yes, the American people were priority number one, but you also have to think about the millions of other people around the world who would be affected. The Executive Committee of the National Security Council was President Kennedy's main points of contact and advisory for the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy did also get input from former Presidents Hoover, Truman, and Eisenhower. Kennedy's cabinet and other congressional leaders were briefed on the situation. Kennedy had a very open style. He liked input from others, but he also knew he couldn't trust everybody. This is shown through his brother, Robert F. Kennedy, being his Attorney General. The United States Ambassador, Sally Stevenson, played the most important role during this crisis. Stevenson heavily advised President Kennedy to abandon his initial plan to attack Cuba and to instead consider the diplomatic option of dismantling U.S. bases in Europe in return for the withdrawal of Soviet missiles in Cuba. Stevenson was a voice of reason, a voice of calming for Kennedy, advocating for negotiation, while others in the cabinet pushed for military action. During this 13-day period, Kennedy made sure his allies, NATO, were kept in the loop about what was going on from their end. And on day 7, President Kennedy briefed British Prime Minister. For my structured analytical technique, I chose to use the Colonial Pipeline timeline. I believe this was the best way to line out the events that occurred before and to the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Each day during this 13-day period was significant in their own way, and the timeline was the best way to display this information. This was a vital national security interest. The U.S. was on the brink of a nuclear war, and the main priority was the American people and protecting the homeland. President Kennedy was very open to outside perspectives and took opinions from most to all senior cabinet members. The executive committee, though, was Kennedy's right-hand men. They helped him deploy military operations and unpack information that was gathered from the intelligence community. Overall, I think this crisis was a success story. Nuclear war was avoided, the Soviet Union's leadership was weakened, and communists did not invade the West. This also led to an establishment of direct communication between Washington and Moscow, which helped prevent future nuclear conflict. I am very confident in my sources, and I believe they are all credible. I stuck to .govs, JFK library files, and informational-based websites like Britannica and archives. There was no informational gaps because this was a very detailed and critical time in history. It was all hands on deck to get as much information as possible to prevent a nuclear blowout.